Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This week, the 23rd to the 29th of August, is Speech Pathology Week, and the theme is communicating with confidence. So in this webinar today, we're hoping to just give you some ideas on how you can help a loved one or someone who you may work with to communicate with confidence. So my name's Nik Byrne. I'm one of the senior speech pathologists at Recovery Station. It's my pleasure to also introduce Bec Capper and Ami Kwong. They will both be also presenting part of today's webinar. We have an experienced speech pathology team at Recovery Station. We have speech pathologists who are based in the Hunter, who are based in Sydney and based in the Central Coast. With increasing demand for our high quality services, we continue to expand our speech pathology team, and we've just recently added 2 new speech pathologists. So this is fantastic because it provides us with a number of speech pathologists with a wide range of clinical experiences to meet the needs of our diverse client groups. So just an introduction to Recovery Station. We're passionate about helping people who have difficulties with any aspect of their life. Recovery Station's been providing allied health services for more than 15 years. It was originally set up in the Hunter and now has expanded to other parts of New South Wales. And in that time, there's been more than 10,000 people who we've been able to help have improvements in the quality of their life. The advantages of a wide multidisciplinary team, and as you can see, we have occupational therapy, dietetics, physiotherapy, exercise physiology, mental health OT, as well as speech pathology, means that we can work together and integrate and coordinate our services to get the best outcomes for our clients. So we've assisted many people to live independently, to drive safely again, to communicate with ease, to walk with confidence, and to live a quality life. With nearly 70 clinicians and 30 support staff, we manage some of the most complex clients in our local communities. So the webinar will just start providing a little bit of information about what is communication, and it may be actually a little bit broader than what you have in mind when you think of communication. First of all, we talk about communication as being active because it's a process where we send a message and the message is received by another person. And speech pathologists call that other person who receives the message quite often the communication partner. And we say it's active because we're actually doing something. So it either requires you to be the person who is exchanging the information or talking, or to be the person who is listening. And when we or a person communicates effectively, it means they're successful in letting other people know their needs, their wants, their feelings and their preferences. Communication is intrinsic to our humanity as social beings. Our relationships are built upon and maintained through our communication. Our education and our work depend on communication, and so does participation in all aspects of our community life, the political systems, and just in the general community. We communicate in many ways, and this is what Amy and Rebecca will also talk about further. We communicate by talking or verbalisation, by vocalisation, so it might be noises or sounds, by showing or pointing to pictures, objects, symbols, or by writing, or also using communication devices. Many people in the community have difficulties with communication, and these difficulties can be mild, so maybe just a little bit of difficulty with some speech sounds, which means that speech may not be 100% clear, or it may be quite severe, where the person may have difficulties with any verbal communication. They may be unable to pronounce words or unable to find the words that they want to say. Communication can affect a person's ability to hear, to talk, to understand, to read, to write, sign, or gesture. Some of these communication difficulties might be present when someone's born, and some developmental difficulties may be as a result of cerebral palsy or autism. So the person may not develop normal language. For other people, they may have developed normal language throughout the early stages of their life, and then something in particular may have happened to them. So they may have had a stroke or a head injury, or they may have a degenerative disease such as multiple sclerosis, motor neurone disease, or Parkinson's disease, where there is a decline in their communication over time. And as you'll hear coming up, there's a number of different types of communication difficulties that someone might have. And for some people, they may have just one of these difficulties, maybe just pronouncing sounds, whereas for some other people, they may have multiple difficulties with communication. So difficulty with finding words and difficulties with interacting with other people. For some people, depending on what their diagnosis is, their communication difficulties might improve. So with therapy, over time, they may have improved ways to communicate with other people. For some people, unfortunately, such as the example of a neurodegenerative disease, their communication difficulties might actually get worse over time. And so speech pathologists and other allied health professionals play a key role in then helping to support the person throughout those changes in their communication. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Bec.
Thanks, Nick. So sort of looking at components of communication. So communication involves speaking, hearing, listening, understanding, social skills, reading, writing, and using voice. So as you can see, it's multifaceted, and a deficit in any of the above areas will impact on a person's ability to communicate as well as participate in day-to-day life and activities. So to look at receptive language as a component. So receptive language is the ability to understand words and language. So it involves gaining information and meaning, not only from routines, but visual information in our environment, sounds and words, concepts such as size, colours and time, looking at grammar, and written information, so signs that we see in day-to-day life, no climbing, toilet. So a person with receptive language difficulties will have difficulties with understanding what is said to them. And they will often have really big difficulties following instructions, especially if they are long and complicated. Then there's expressive language. And expressive language is using words, sentences, gestures and writing to convey our meaning and messages. And it's not only just verbal expression, it's also written expression. So it's being able to label objects in the environment, putting words together in sentences, being able to answer questions, tell a story and write a story. And these people with expressive language difficulties will have difficulty translating their thoughts into speech. It can be very frustrating in getting their messages out. And then we're going to look through actual speech. So looking at speech sounds, our intelligibility and our voice. So articulation is the way we produce our speech sounds, and we use our articulators such as our tongue, our lips, our teeth and jaw and our vocal folds to produce speech sounds. And as Australian English speakers, we move our mouth in different positions to create our consonant and vowel sounds. So someone who has difficulty making sounds and using their articulators, they'll have reduced intelligibility. And this is how well they can be understood, particularly by strangers, so people just in day-to-day life. The people with reduced intelligibility will have communication breakdowns often, and they may often substitute sounds for another, leave sounds out, add sounds or change sounds. And it can be very hard for people to understand them in day-to-day life. And voice issues we see commonly in the community. So voice is something that we often take for granted, but there's a great deal involved in making and producing voice. So voice is where air gets pushed up from the lungs to the vocal cords, and those vocal cords vibrate, and then that vibrated air is shaped into speech sounds. So a voice disorder can be caused by something that's structural, such as vocal polyps, or just through misuse or abuse of your voice. So when you're unwell with a cold, continuing to talk for great periods of time. Moving on and looking at pragmatics. So pragmatics, also known as social skills, is the way children and adults use language within social situations. And it has three components. So the ability to use language for different purposes, so greeting and farewelling people. The ability to adapt language to meet the needs of the listener. So we talk obviously quite differently to a baby versus an adult. And being aware, which is sometimes the hardest part, following those unspoken rules of conversation. So how do we take turns in conversation, eye contact, and using those facial expressions and gestures. And a pragmatic disorder or difficulties will occur when a person has difficulty using those verbal and non-verbal communication in day-to-day life. And finally, having a look at fluency. So fluency looks at the smoothness in which sounds, syllables, words and phrases are joined together during speech. And a fluency disorder is often more commonly known as stuttering. So in conversation, we might see someone who has trouble starting sounds or has trouble, producing sounds, and they might prolong, one sound in particular. Or they may just not be able to even produce that sound and have what we call a block. So they're the different components of communication. And as we can see, there's a great deal involved. And a number of our clients, we see have communication deficits across those areas. I'm going to pass on to Amy.
So what's the impact of being unable to communicate? We've already seen from the definition that when we can successfully communicate, it means that we can let other people know our needs, our wants, our feelings, and our preferences. So communication is not only central to how people enjoy many of their human rights, it's also the way in which we express our human rights, to be able to, let people know or voice our concerns. And Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually identifies that all people have the right to be able to communicate. And for speech pathologists, it's also thinking about that communication is successful and that it's understood by the communication partner. So let's see what some of those implications might be. We know that communication is important to the development of relationships. So relationships are when two or more people, come together and they're connected. And part of that connection involves an emotional connection, a social connection, and it's around communication. So letting other people know how you're feeling, showing interest in them and, connecting on that social interaction level. Being able to communicate is important to be able to develop friendships, and whether that's friendships at school or friendships in the workplace or just out in the community, and enjoying companionship of another person and not being isolated by yourself. Our quality of life includes everything from physical health, family, education, religious beliefs, and the environment. And all these areas are things that require the ability to communicate with other people. What we know is when people can't communicate successfully and when they can't let people know how they're feeling, that this may result in some behaviours presenting. So as a result of frustration, it might mean that there's some aggression because the person can't let someone know that there's something that they don't like or there's something that they're not happy about. Or if they're trying to let, a carer or a helper know that, they want something in particular and they can't get that message across, then it may result in some, aggression being displayed to the communication partner or to someone else. Being unable to communicate successfully can impact upon leisure activities. So being able to let your family or your support worker or carers know that maybe there's something in particular that you'd like to be able to do, that you might like to join a bowling group or you might like to socialise or go to a disco. If people can't communicate, then people tend to not take into consideration that there might be opportunities that they might enjoy. So they might not be looking for volunteer opportunities, additional education opportunities, or even employment. And we know that for people that have disabilities, and in particular communication disabilities, their employment rates are lower than other people in the general community. Some really important things to think about when we're talking about communication is we, as verbal communicators, successful verbal communicators, are very easily able to let people know how we feel. And in particular, we're able to let people know if we feel safe and how we're feeling emotionally. So if we're scared or if we're frightened. So some of the risks associated to someone having a communication difficulty might mean that they are unable to communicate this to their loved ones or to support workers. So they may be unable to say, I don't really like working with that person, or something happened at the day program, that concerned me. So there's a lot of risk associated with groups of people who are vulnerable and who are unable to communicate that vulnerability. So it's important that people are able to let those people who support them know if they have some concerns, if there's anything they like or they dislike, if there's any issues around their physical safety, their emotional safety, and we need to make sure that there's mechanisms that they can let people know how they're feeling. We need to ensure that people have an ability to communicate, no, I'm not happy with that, or stop in particular. So communication with people with communication difficulties are much more likely to be treated differently. So we do have, risk of discrimination, and we need to ensure that they're not suffering that or exploitation. So now we're going to move on to Amy, and she's going to tell us about some of the things that speech pathologists do and how they can help.
Thanks, Nick. So as mentioned, speech pathologists, we study, diagnose and treat communication disorders, including what Bex has mentioned just now. So people might have difficulties with speaking, listening, understanding language, reading, writing, social skills, stuttering, or even just issues with using their voice. So we as speech pathologists, we work with people who have difficulty communicating, and these can be caused by stroke, brain injuries, intellectual disabilities, and other problems that can affect someone's speech and language. So when we work with adults, it's very important to consider functional communication goals. It's because adults learn things differently compared to young children. So if you think about this, children learn because they're told to learn things, and these things have relevance in the distant future, and they usually do so without questioning why. But adults need to be explicitly told what they're doing and why they do so they can connect the desired learning outcomes to their own goals and progress, which is a huge part of NDIS. We want to be able to find goals that are closely related to a person's life and their activities of daily living, goals that would be motivating for them and allow them to have better choice and control, as well as better quality of life. So what we do is sometimes we teach people strategies to use in their lives to help them communicate better, or sometimes we use different therapy approaches to help them regain their communication skills. So here are some examples of functional communication goals. For example, if there's a person with unclear speech, or if he's nonverbal, we might set a goal to help him be able to order his own food at the restaurant using, for example, drill speech, a cue card, or even a community request card, where the person can just hand a card over to the communication partner or the person working at the counter to get them what they want. Some other goals could be being able to read and write simple messages, for example, writing a birthday card for a family member. Sometimes people come to us with unclear speech. Perhaps they had a stroke, or perhaps they have Parkinson's disease. One of the goals that I had with one of the guys is just to help them use clear speech strategy so they can have better speech clarity to give a speech. For example, during a daughter's wedding. So that's something, a goal that's very motivating, and the person will most likely be very motivated to work on. Sometimes we also use assistive technology, for example, voice input, spell check, or even applications on the phone or an iPad to help the person read and write. So there are apps on the iPhone or the iPad which allows you to take a picture of the written text and it gives you a speech output. So it helps the person read, for example, things like recipes or letters. So we speech pathologists, we provide language therapy focusing on different areas and aspects of language. For example, when we are targeting verbal comprehension, we will use games or activities that require auditory memory or comprehension skills. For example, one game that I like to use is Taboo. It's a really fun game where you have to describe a word to another person without using the 5 taboo words. So sometimes I'll get the clients to listen to a voicemail so I can ask them questions afterwards. It helps them learn how to retain information and extract information from the verbal input. Sometimes when we work on verbal expression skills, we do role plays with our clients. Sometimes we do role plays in phone calls as well, so that way they can build a bit more confident when they're doing phone calls. There are other types of therapy approaches we use. For example, just to name a few, constraint-induced aphasia therapy, the NEST therapy, and semantic feature analysis are some of the approaches we use with stroke clients or people with aphasia or acquired neurological communication disorders. So when we sometimes we work on written comprehension. So helping, like just what I said before, using apps or strategies to help the person read real life materials to text, for example, newspaper ads, menus, recipes, bank statements, etc. Sometimes we have clients coming to us saying they'd like to learn how to read and write because they never had the chance to do it when they were younger. So there's a method called the Spalding method, which helps the person learn how to spell and read simple words. Sometimes we also use a variety of different texts. For example, sometimes we'll get the clients to write some shopping list. We'll get them to write greeting cards. We'll help them manage the diary. For example, at the end of each session, we get them to write down the appointment in their own diary. So speech therapists also work with clients who have unclear speech or any voice disorders. So sometimes our clients just refer to us because they have slurred speech. So we'll use clear speech strategies with them. And for some of the Parkinson's clients, we use the LSVT approach, which is a very evidence-based voice therapy approach that would help them regain that loudness in their speech so they will be able to express themselves a bit better. And there are also a couple of different other therapy approaches, such as the voice craft, resonance voice therapy, and accent method. Speech pathologists also provide therapy on multimodal communication. So we encourage the use of both nonverbal and verbal strategies. For example, we encourage the person to describe, paraphrase, draw, or gesture. Just encouraging that idea of total communication and using all the methods and tools they have to communicate what they want. And of course, we also provide assessment and therapy on the use of alternative augmentative communication. So if the person's nonverbal, sometimes we would try and explore different low-tech or even high-tech options to help them request, comment, and communicate better. Some examples are, for example, the talking tiles and some apps on the iPad, for example, Proloquo to Go, Word Power. And sometimes we will explore different access methods as well, for example, using eye gaze and head pointing. So I'll hand back to Nik for the last part of our presentation.
So how can you help someone who has a communication difficulty to be confident with their communication? The first way would be to see whether they have seen a speech pathologist and whether there's any specific therapy techniques or specific therapy strategies that have been recommended by the speech pathologist. So, for example, the person might have a specific communication device, or they might use natural gesture, or they might use keyword sign. So it's important that the people working with that person understand how they communicate and how to best support them. If the person is using keyword sign, and so there's an example given on the slides there, then the people around them need to also know basic keyword sign in order to be able to communicate with them, to be able to help their understanding, as well as to know what the person is actually requesting when they use the keyword sign. I think one important thing with communication is actually having a genuine interest in the person and communicating with them. So I put patience there because it's a really important thing. Sometimes people who do have communication difficulties, really the greatest thing that helps them is just to provide them with a little bit of time. So it's about not rushing them when they're communicating. The research shows that we feel uncomfortable when there's about a half a second delay in someone responding. So what typically happens if someone has a communication difficulty and they may be a little bit slow to think of the word, or it might take them a little while to actually process and pronounce the word, by the time they get to actually have their turn in the conversation, someone else has already jumped in and have answered for them. And it's more because the person listening feels a little bit uncomfortable about waiting. So one of the best things that you can do is actually, if you're communicating with someone who does have difficulties, is just to wait. Just, count in your head to 10 or 20 and just allow them the time. And it's a really important thing because, it's really about respect, because if we keep jumping in and trying to answer for someone else and we don't allow them the time that they need, or if, we're waiting for them to answer the question and then we start, turning and then talking to someone else, like we're not showing them the respect that we want to communicate with them. So, I think really they would be my main tips, finding out how to best support them and then practicing the communication with the person and allowing them the time and showing them that you're genuinely interested in them and what they want to communicate. So find out about their interests, find out about their hobbies, and keep the communication at a level which is suitable for their understanding. So our key messages we'd like people to take away from today is that it is a human right to be able to communicate, and that's for all people to be able to communicate. As we've seen, communication can look very different for different people, and there may be a lot of different ways that people can communicate. For some people, communication is challenging, and speech pathologists, as the experts in assessment of communication, diagnosis, and providing therapy and management, we can help people with communication problems. We work really closely with the people who support the person with that communication difficulty. So we provide a lot of training and education to support workers or family workers on how to best facilitate and help the person to have successful communication, which will allow them to enjoy a quality of life. If you have any further questions about anything that's been presented in the webinar, or if you have a referral or you would like to speak to the referrals team about someone who may have a communication difficulty that you think would benefit from speech pathology services, or in fact any of the allied health services that we provide, our information details are provided on the last slide. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It is, we forgot to say we are doing this because it is Speech Week. So thank you to all the lovely speeches out there that are doing so much, obviously, as we've just learnt, to assist in achieving goals, empowering people to live more quality of life. And we will be sending out this recording to those who are not able to attend live. And do keep an eye out for other webinars that we'll be hosting further on later down in the year. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bec, Amy, and Dr. Nik.